In the character creation scene, you can see that we have a bunch of stats here, a bunch of skills here, and their final values. And while they all start at 11 points, the actual final value of might, accuracy, and speed have been modified because this is a human scout. And if we change these, you can see that the actual values of these various stats are changing as well. Let's do a deep dive into stats. So we're going to open our Game Modules Manager window here. I'm going to dock it down here, make it a little bit wider and taller. Let's start by creating some stats. I'm going to create stats for a fantasy game, but keep in mind that game modules can be used for any game type of any game genre, any game style. While I'm going to use fantasy for this demonstration, you can do whatever kind of game you want. Game modules lets you make your game the way you want to make it. So let's start with some main stats. I'm going to call these main stats. Now that we have main stats, I'm also going to create some more stats that I think we're going to use for this demo. Alright, so I'm going to pause here. I have a whole bunch of skills. These are going to be things that we can learn. Some party stats here, really just one party stats for the gold, and then main stats for all the main stats that each player might have in this game. Now, I'm assuming this game might have one player, it might have multiple players, but all the bad guys, all the enemies, all the NPCs can also have the same stats set up. So now we're going to start setting these up and hooking them up to each other so we can start kind of building our web of stats. So let's start with the skills here. Now keep in mind we can look at the skills in the inspector, or we can load them up here, and if we change anything here, it changes it in the inspector. Both will be changed. They're showing the exact same thing. The Game Modules window does have these helpful little drop downs that will give you kind of a list view of some of the details on the objects. Let's look at the can be trained and can be modified buttons here. Since these are skills, we want them to be something the player can train throughout the game, and we also want them to be something the player can modify with other stats or item objects, item attributes, or conditions, etc. You can see here we have a warning that our mastery levels are not set up. That's because we have it set to be can be trained, and when they can be trained, it means that there has to be a mastery level. So those are the levels that you actually train throughout the game. Since these are all skills, we want them all to be trainable or modifiable. In this view, instead of just clicking one by one, we can actually hold shift down and click all of them to set all of them to be both trainable and modifiable. You can see now that they're listed here as skills modifiable. For gold, we don't want it to be trainable or modifiable, so we're going to leave these both off, and that means that gold is going to be a counter. So this is something where the points will be really the only thing that matter here. You could add base value and base proficiency, but in general, if it's going to be a counter, then you're really only going to be worrying about the points, and so we're going to leave that as it is. And for the main stats, we want them to be modifiable, but we don't want them to be trainable. So let's go ahead and turn modifiable on for all of them. Again, I'm holding shift down while I select that to set all of the same type. Now, when we load up one of these, we can see that they're listed as a stat. That's anything that can be modified but can't be trained is considered a stat in this context. Just an easy way of thinking about it. That means that it can be changed by other values, by other stats, by item objects, attributes, conditions, etc. Those can affect the stat, but it's only going to have one essential level throughout the entire game. Now is a great time to dig deep into what these are: points, base value, base proficiency, and final stat. So let's load up the scripting docs. If you go to infinitypbr.com, you click the scripting docs here, and that takes us to all the documentation. There's a whole lot here, so definitely make use of this site and let me know if I'm missing anything. And we click the stats here, we have a little flow chart that demonstrates what exactly it is that these points, base value, and base proficiency end up doing to the final stat. There are three aspects to a final stat, which is, the final value of whatever stat it is, or whatever skill it is, or whatever counter it is, really. It starts with the stat points. Points are something that you can change during the game. There's a method called AddPoints that just adds or subtracts, if you add negative points, value to that setting. The actual point value can't be modified by other stats or item objects or other modifiers. However, the base value can be. This is also a float, and the final value is going to be the stat-based value, which is this value here, plus any other thing that affects this value. So there's going to be weapons, there's going to be spells, there's going to be conditions. Things that affect the stat value is going to be called other values. We add those together to get the final value, and we add the stat points and final value together. Similar to the values, we have this concept of a proficiency. Now it defaults to 0, which means you're perfectly proficient. There's no benefit, there's no deficit. When we have our final value and stat points together, we also compute the final proficiency, which is going to be the base proficiency on the stat itself, plus other proficiency. These are, again, other things that are modifying this proficiency, and then we add 1 to it. That means that if the final proficiency is otherwise 0, we're going to multiply the final value and stat points by 1. And that means essentially no modification. And that's going to be the final stat. There's an example here on the docs if you'd like to get into it a little bit more, but let's go ahead and move on now. So we need to set up our mastery levels so that these skills can be set up properly. So let's go back here to the game modules window. Let's go ahead and click on mastery levels, and we're going to create a new mastery level called skills. The type can't be mastery level or mastery levels, so we'll call this actor mastery levels as the type. We'll create that. When we load it up in the inspector, we can see that we have to create individual mastery levels. So I'm going to create 4 here. We're going to call this novice, and we'll call one master, and expert, and grandmaster. The information here says that we need the least proficient to be on the top and the most proficient on the bottom. So I'm going to move expert up, so it's novice, expert, master, and grandmaster. We do have the dictionaries module. Check out a video on the deep dive into the dictionaries to see how you might use this in the context of mastery levels. But for this purposes, we are done here. So let's go back to the stats, and we're going to click on the types, and that will essentially set our mastery levels for anything that doesn't have a mastery levels yet set. So let's go back to our stats and check out our error magic here. Now we can see we don't have the error anymore, and when we click on the mastery levels, we can see our 4 mastery levels here: novice, expert, master, grandmaster. In fact, we can go back over here and you can always add more mastery levels, and then they show up right here as well. So what exactly is a mastery level for? Well, these skills are going to do more than just enable things in the game. Yes, they will enable things in the game. Perhaps a player needs to have the air magic skill to learn air magic spells. But there are some skills that might have an effect on other stats. For example, the bodybuilding stat might have an impact on the stamina of a character. And so we can set that up by clicking on the mastery levels and then clicking on whichever one of these we want to work on. It doesn't really matter at this point. And then right here in the yellow section, select a stat to be modified by this object. Now you can search for stats if you'd like, or you can just use the drop down here. We're going to go with stamina, and we're going to add that to the list here. Now you can add as many things to the list as you'd like. It doesn't really matter, and then this will have an effect on all of those different things. But for this purpose, we're just going to affect the stamina. Now, by default, there are 2 options here. There's the base value and proficiency and per skill point value and proficiency. Any adjustment here to the base value and proficiency are going to be computed in this part of this other values as the number they are. So if I put 3 here, then the value of stamina on the target actor who has this bodybuilding skill will increase by 3. If I add 0.1 to the proficiency, then the proficiency will increase by 0.1, effectively giving a 10% boost to the final stat value of the stamina stat. The other way of doing it is per skill point. Now this is going to be per point in the bodybuilding skill. So instead of giving 3, we might give 1 per skill point. So now every time my skill point in bodybuilding goes up, the value of stamina will go up by 1. This is one way to allow your players to assign points to their skills and then have the impact of those skills increase throughout their game. So in my game, one common thing I like to do is to give a 10% boost to things like stamina. So for this, I'm going to put a base proficiency of 0.09 and a per skill point proficiency of 0.01. That means that when bodybuilding has only 1 point, 1 skill point assigned, then it's going to be a 10% boost to stamina. However, if the player adds a second skill point to bodybuilding, then this will be 0.2, this will remain 0.9, so it will be 11%. So at novice level, every time the player adds a skill point, the percentage increase in stamina goes up by just 1%. So let's click this copy button and then go over to our expert. We're going to paste the modification list. That pastes everything from novice into expert here, and then allows us to modify this. So I'm going to say at expert level, everything's just going to be doubled, and at master level, everything's going to be tripled. At grandmaster level, everything is going to be quadrupled. That means that if you are a grandmaster in bodybuilding and your skill points are just 1, then you'll have a 40% increase to your final stamina number. Keep in mind, this will only affect the player if the player has the bodybuilding skill in their stat list. If we hop over to the player character here, you can see that the player has a GameModuleActors actor on it. And if you add that to your player, you can see that there is this stats list here. There's a game stat list. If bodybuilding is not in this, then the strength stat will not be affected at all by it. So I want to bring your attention to this links to other stats section at the bottom. This is a nice little helpful section so you can kind of visualize what kind of stats affect each other. We can see that stamina is affected by this, but it's also directly affected by this. In some cases, you might have one stat or skill that affects another, which affects another in a chain reaction, and this will kind of help you visualize what that looks like. So let's check out Arms Master. As a skill, the mastery levels are already set here. So for Arms Master, I'm thinking this will affect the different weapon skills in some way, shape, or form. So I'm just going to add all of the skills here for weapons. So just like bodybuilding, Arms Master is going to give the player a 10% proficiency boost to all of their weapon skills when they have the Arms Master on their stats list. Alright, so I've copied over those and set up the different mastery levels for each, similar to bodybuilding. Now, keep in mind, we haven't yet actually determined what proficiency in axe and dagger and spear actually mean. In fact, that's something that's probably pretty much out of scope for this demo, because what that means for your game might be different than what it means for my game. So one of the key concepts of game modules is that it allows you to make your game the way you want to make your game. It's extremely flexible in that regard, meaning it gives you the tools to use, but you don't have to use them. And it's just important to keep that in mind. It's extremely flexible, and you can set things up in many different ways to have many different game mechanics in your game. Let's do the same for Spellmaster. Great, let's go ahead and select our experience. And I wanted to demonstrate more on this panel on the main settings. So our experience is going to be a counter. We're going to increase that throughout the game. And so since it's going to be a counter, we actually want to turn this off so that it's just a counter. It means it can't be modified by other things. The final value of it can't be modified. And while we're here, we should probably do the same to health and magic. That's going to be like our magic points, as all three of these are just going to be counters. Now, health max and magic max, those might be modified by other things, but the actual health, the ups and downs of health throughout the game, is just going to be a counter as it goes up and down. We have the ability here to set a minimum and a maximum value. Now, we could just set a basic minimum of float 0, which means it's never going to be below 0, or we could set it to be the points of another stat. So we can choose any other stat from the list here, and that means that the value of experience points will never be lower than the points of that other stat. We could also set it to be the value, which is going to be referring to the final value, not the base value, and the proficiency, which is referring to the final proficiency, not the base proficiency, or the final stat of another thing here, of another stat. We're going to select float and just put this as 0 so it can never go below 0. And since this can't be modified, it means we don't need to worry about these other values. We also have this feature called modified by this proficiency. What this means is that whenever we use the AddPoints method to either add or subtract points, we can modify that value by the proficiency of another stat. That way, we can increase or decrease the amount of points being added based on some other arbitrary value. So let's go and set that up so that our skill learning has an impact on the experience that the player gets throughout the game. To do this, I'm going to create a new stat called called experience mod, and we're going to make this a hidden stat. So our experience mod is something that can be modified by others, but it can't be trained. So we're going to leave it with just modified. It's a stat. And then let's go over to our learning skill. We're going to check out our mastery levels and add that hidden stat to our effects list here. Now let's go ahead and set this up just like we did with the others. All right, so now whenever a player has the learning skill, they will have an impact on their experience mod, which is a hidden stat that they probably won't be exposed to throughout the game. However, if we go back to our experience, we can now add our experience mod to our modified by this proficiency. That means that if we have learning, and that gives a 10%, there's a proficiency of 0.1 when there's only one skill point assigned, then every time we add 100 points to experience, we'll actually get 110 experience added. This is super helpful when you have events like bad guys and quests and other things that give you experience or other points, and you don't want to worry about handling the math behind modifications. This will all do it for you. So let's check out our health. This is a counter that's going to be tracking our health or hit points throughout the game. And so we also have a health max value. So let's make sure our health is never actually greater than our maximum health. So we're going to go to the points here and select final stat of health max. That means that even if we add 100,000 points to health, it will never go beyond the final stat of health max. We can also choose to make sure the minimum is always 0. That way it's clamped between 0 and whatever the maximum health is for the value of health max. We can do the same thing with the magic. And the last option down here is rounding. Depending on your project, you might want the health to always be a whole number, in which case you can choose to round to the floor, round to the ceiling, or if you're okay with some decimal places, you can choose to round to a specific number of decimal places, such as 2. So the last options on the main settings here are these Blackboard settings. The Blackboard is a great way to share data between objects or to post data to the Blackboard so that other objects that care about that data can either look it up or be notified about it. So here you can choose to post to the Blackboard, and you can also notify followers of the values when they're posted. Now, in some cases, you might not want all actors who have magic or some other stat to post everything to the Blackboard, because that could fill the Blackboard up with a lot of information that you don't really care about, especially if a lot of NPCs and bad guys have these stats and we only really care about the player stats being posted to the Blackboard. So in that case, you probably want to keep these checked off and instead use the game stat list force post to Blackboard value for individual game stat lists that you do want to post to the Blackboard. For instance, if you want all of the stats on the player to post to the Blackboard, then in your start actions on the player, make sure you just set this value to be true for the game stat list. And that means that even though these are false, for that one list, any stat inside will post these values to the Blackboard and notify followers. That's super helpful if your UI or other things are looking for changes in this information in order to update or do other actions. For any stat that can't be trained, instead of mastery levels, we have a stat effects tab. Now you don't see the novice, grandmaster, master, and expert here, the different mastery levels we've set up, because this isn't something that can be trained, but it can still have an impact on other things. And finally, we have the dictionaries. To set up a dictionaries, you actually want to go down to the types here and then click on the dictionary structure to open that up. And then click on dictionary structure to open up the dictionaries here and add the key. The reason why this is in types is because every object of the same type needs to have the same dictionary structure. The individual values inside the dictionaries can be different, but the structure needs to stay the same. So we're going to add a key for skills called flavor text. And we're also going to add a key called icon. Now for flavor text, we're going to show the string as a text box. Icon isn't going to be a string, so we're just going to ignore that. So now if we go to our skills and we click on dictionaries, we can see that each one will have a flavor text and an icon, and we can then add list types to those. Each dictionary's key can have any number of objects from these different types, which include standard types like float, bool, etc., and game module types like item object, attribute, quest, and then other types like sprites, animation clips, audio clips, and so on. So for our flavor text, we're going to add a string, and for our icon, we're going to add a sprite. So while we've exposed these so that we can actually type them in or set them, we don't actually have anything populated yet. So what I'm going to type in this is flavor text and just add that. And now you can see it's showing as a text box because we selected that option. Now we can change this to be something else for our arms master. So provides a boost to proficiency of all weapon types. All right. And I've brought in two sprites from another project, so we're going to add those here so you can see what they would look like when we add sprites in to this window. This is a great time to talk about the generated scripts here. Over in our assets, we have our game modules objects, and inside this we have our default location for all of our objects, all our scriptable objects, but we also have this game modules generated scripts. There's right now two things in here. One is the properties script. This is automatically generated as we add new stats and other objects to the project. Check out the properties deep dive video for more information, but this is an easy way to access the stats and other objects when you're coding your project. The other object here is this object reference. There are a lot of different data types like sprites that can't be serialized at runtime. And so this is automatically populated whenever we add stuff to the dictionaries that can't be serialized. We actually track the GUIDs here, and then we store the GUID in the dictionary rather than the object itself. And then at runtime, it's automatically populated. If we haven't yet populated the object, we look it up real quick by the GUID rather than having to serialize something that can't be serialized. Generally speaking, you'll never actually need to check this object reference, but if you ever see it and wonder what the heck it's doing there, that's what it's doing there. So that's the end of the stats creation and setup tutorial. However, if you want to learn more about how you can use stats at runtime and how other things can affect stats, check out the party-based RPG demo game. In the character creation scene, you can see that we have a bunch of stats here, a bunch of skills here, and their final values. And while they all start at 11 points, the actual final value of might, accuracy, and speed have been modified because this is a human scout. And if we change these, you can see that the actual values of these various stats are changing as well. And that's because every character race and every character class has different proficiency modifications on the various stats. So a half-orc knight is going to be much stronger, but maybe doesn't have such a great personality, while an elf mage is going to have a really high wisdom, but perhaps a little bit low stamina, and then other things aren't modified at all. This project really does dive deep into how you can use all of these things together to create a very dynamic and automatic system. This scene in particular, the whole demo game, but this scene in particular is a great example of how you can use stats and other things together in order to modify the final stats. It's important to note that in the actual code here, all I'm doing when I click this button is saying stat might add points 1, and everything else is handled automatically. I don't have to tell it to recompute. I don't have to tell this to redraw. Everything is handled automatically because everything is already connected via the game modules. So definitely check that out and come to the Discord. Let me know if you have any questions. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you real soon. Thanks.